Welcome back. Just before the break, we told you about a UBC study that shows the majority of baby boomers think they should be the top or highest priority for the government, while older generations feel they should take a priority. Clearly, there's a generational difference here and some strong feelings on each side. For more, we're joined by Susan Eng, who's the Vice President of Advocacy for CARP, a national seniors advocacy group, and Sandra Martin, Executive Editor of today's Parent Magazine. Hello, both of you.
Hi.
Sandra, let me start with you. What's your reaction to this new study?
Well, I actually am familiar with the study. There was a release that came out in October of this year, really looking at the fact that compared to families raising their children in the 70s, today's families are much worse off financially in terms of resources that are available to them and in terms of support. And not only that, I don't know if you covered this before the break, but $4 billion per year spent by Canadian businesses to help support this shortfall by, keeping workers, giving workers time off, lost productivity, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not just a I deserve it more than you problem. It's a problem that actually trickles over into other parts, other generations of our society.
Right. Susan, I think it's true that this generation, the older generation now, seniors, are the wealthiest generation this country has produced. Should they be the highest priority because of that, because of how much they've paid into the system?
Well, I think that it's important to recognize that they have paid into the system, and I take exception to the concern that somehow they're asking for more than their share. If they reflect some concern over what is going on in their own circumstances, I think it reflects the economic downturn of the last couple of years in particular, when the retirement savings were devastated by the market downturn. So they're not as wealthy as everybody thinks. Their ability to retire, especially for the pre-retirees, they're not so sure they're not going to have to keep working. So I think that we're getting into a level of great anxiety. I think the facts and figures give a gross generalization of what's happening, and it is true that housing prices, for example, increased dramatically over the last 10 years, but they're not going to keep going, and you can't eat your houses. So people are finding they're going to have trouble making ends meet, and I think that's some cause for anxiety, and that could explain why you got the answers that you did.
Okay. Sandra, what do you think?
I'd like to jump in and say that, you can't eat your house, but you can downsize. And I'm hearing from, hardworking Canadians, and we're not talking about the spoiled brat Canadians who want to have it all right away. We've heard about our generation being the, I want it now, I want it now, I want it now generation. But I'm talking about families who work hard, who just cannot get into the housing market because, a variety of factors. Interest rates are so low, housing prices have inflated, partially because of that, partially because of inflation. They just can't get into the housing market. So they're paying money into rent that they will never get back. So I'm not saying that every retiree should downsize, but that's an option that young families don't have.
Can I ask you both, there are implications here, even if, as Susan suggests, that these may be grossly simplified, there are indications here that governments need to balance the sometimes competing interests of both. Susan, do you think that's happening here, especially in the federal level?
Well, I think that the politicians never look at the long-term view. They tend to oil the squeaky wheel. And we made the point in this last election that older voters vote all the time and the issues that resonate with them. But they're not being selfish. They're identifying issues that are going to help Canadians for the longer term. For example, when we push on pension reform, it's not going to help anybody who's already retired, even near retirement. This is going to help the next generation. So you have to take from the wisdom of what they're going through, what they're seeing. They see how their children behave, how their grandchildren behave, and they have some advice for us. And so all we're saying from an advocacy standpoint is to say, listen to them. They've gone through it. They know what's going on. It is not so easy to downsize. People live in a community all their lives, and now you're asking them to disrupt their lives in order to afford to pay for food. This is something that is a problem. So I think that we have to concentrate on those people who need it, people who live in poverty. We also have to make sure that we balance the kind of policies that allow people to save and help themselves over the longer term.
Interesting enough, I have been up on the Hill for a long time. I don't think anyone would argue with me that this Conservative government has really focused on families in its budgets and in some of the programs it's brought in. Right. Sandra, do you agree with that?
I still think, things like daycare other resources like that that make it possible for families to bring in the income that is required to own a house, to have a decent standard of living. There's still not a lot of support for that. And I know that there are promises of more coming, but it's not just the money, it's the fact that in dense urban areas. I live in a community called East York in Toronto, where, typically it's been older Canadians, so there just is not the infrastructure to have daycare. The idea of the Ontario government allowing, having a full day kindergarten, well, that's great, but it's still only 9 to 3:30. That doesn't help dual income working parents, for the most part. So there needs to be more availability of daycare. It's not just a subsidy issue. It's allowing allowing the opportunity for people to have a licensed daycare facility where their children are getting educated, not just watched, so that they can be productive on the world stage as they become adults.
And I would say that the people that I represent would not disagree with that. They want to make sure that their children and grandchildren are well looked after as well. So I don't think that we should allow government to play one generation off against the next. I think that's an important message. There are ways to structure how we spend the money that we're spending now in a better way so that there is more money to help families with daycare, for example. But we also, at our end, are looking for support for people looking after older loved ones at home. This is starting to become a really serious both a problem and an opportunity, because more of us are getting older and we want to deal with our medical challenges at home. And to do that, you need the system to restructure how it delivers on healthcare, how it helps family caregivers. And if we do that, we have the opportunity. This weekend, the finance ministers are meeting. They have the opportunity to actually help us divert massive amounts of demand from the healthcare system if we do this properly.
Yeah, I'm not trying to create a phony choice here, but there are decisions that have to be made. And when I asked Sandra about the government making the choice to support families, it has come at the expense of other groups. And I want to get a sense from you, Susan, before I leave this. You mentioned pensions. The argument that comes back from the government is that they really can't raise Canadian pension plan contributions now because of the fragile economic recovery. But they do have money for younger families and tax write-offs. So I think a choice is being made here in some cases.
To some extent, but the Canadian pension plan is being funded by our own contributions. The government doesn't put any money in at all.
No, but they're arguing on behalf of small businesses in particular who have to make contributions
that's right.
as well.
But the small business, the amounts that we're talking about, even to double or raise the CPP by only 10%, it's like $40 a month more. So they're not really the job killers that some people say it is. And I think that the government has to spend political capital in that case, not money from the Treasury.
I'd like to jump in and say that it also is important to make it possible for young families to contribute to RRSPs so that in retirement they aren't relying so heavily on government funds on the CPP. So families are telling us at the magazine that they don't have any money left over to save, let alone put into an RRSP or an RESP for their children. So there needs to be some allowance made for people to take care of themselves.
But the point that we make in terms of how people save is that right now, with the vehicles that are available to middle-income families, they're not using them now. And part of the reason why they don't use those RSPs is that it doesn't earn them very much money. And that's why we at CARP have been focusing on getting some kind of pension arrangement that allows people to save as well as they could if they had the CPP. And of course, it means you have to have some money to save with to begin with. But when you start to save, when you choose to save, put it into a vehicle that's going to protect your money, that will give you an adequate income at the end of the day. And we're saying that the government's proposal for a PRPP is not going to do that. So we are focusing on those things to make sure that people have a good, healthy, and dignified retirement.
And I would agree, it's not one generation versus the other. We are all working together, and hopefully we can figure out a way so that neither one of us is left in the cold.
Well, look, I wish we had more time. It's a really fascinating discussion. Thank you both for coming to share your thoughts with us.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Susan Eng is with the Canadian Association of Retired Persons, and Sandra Martin is the executive editor of today's Parent Magazine. Well, the House of Commons is officially on its holidays, and like what happens to many of us this time of year,